We live on YouTube?
We're live on YouTube. That's right.
Really? Am I allowed to say?
Yeah, for sure. They'll just have to edit you out in post-production. All right. Well, I think we're ready to officially kick off. People are still rolling in, but we can get started. First, good to see everybody here. I think we've seen a lot of familiar faces show up again and again, and so we appreciate seeing the same people come in, and of course, always welcome new people. But it really starts to feel like we have kind of some continuity in the conversations. For those of you who are new, we're DK and Mishti from the Highlighter team, and we're building Highlighter as a place to gather to read and discuss great writing. And these town halls are a way to bring writers into the mix to jam with us and to dig deeper on their ideas. We've recently been doing a few sessions on more deeply researched blog pieces, and so Nathan's 4-part series on disruption theory fits perfectly with that agenda.
Yeah, and there's so many reasons to be excited about this. I think one of them is that, Nathan, it's sort of meta. I was telling one of my friends today, like, you're writing about disruption theory, but arguably you're also living it right now as a disruptor yourself. So I'm
That's
super
very
excited.
flattering. It's way too early to say, but hopefully it will become something like that. But thank you.
Definitely. Yeah. So I think there's gonna be lots to dig in there. And DK, do you want to give a quick note on format and we can kick it off?
Sure. So notes on format. So the magic of the town hall is when we keep it super participatory. So please feel free to chime in. You can have ideas or questions. You can throw them up on the chat there. We'll tag you up and you can ask your question live. And yeah, I think like keep it participatory. We've got plenty, I told Mishti before this, we were gathering our thoughts, and I said, I could spend a whole hour just one-on-one interviewing Nathan just about like the first point. But we don't want it to be a fireside chat because it's great to have all the energy of you coming together to help us surface kind of new and interesting ideas from Nathan's writing. So so that's the basics there. And then we are recording the session as we always do for the Highlighter live sessions. So we're streaming this live to YouTube right now, and we're making a video of it. We'll do some post-production, so it'll be packaged up and something that people can learn from the discussion, even if they couldn't attend today. We've had lots and lots of requests actually for that. So people have asked us from all over the world. Some people, the time zone doesn't work, but they said, I really want to hear from Nathan and I want to hear kind of the discussion. So I'm sure it'll be a well-watched video.
Nice.
Yeah, totally. And
well, I have great taste, apparently. I love that. I'm just kidding.
Yeah. So, okay, in the spirit of getting everyone involved, I do have a question, which is chime in on chat with your favorite Substack besides Nathan's, so we can get some recs going. And
choose from any one of super organizers, napkin math, means of creation.
Yeah, it might be a challenging task to pick one that Nathan doesn't touch, but more on that soon. And I also want to just get Molly up to intro.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure to introduce Nathan Baschez here today. And for those of you who haven't checked out his newsletter, Divinations, Nathan is an incredibly insightful business and strategy thinker, as both David and Mishti have mentioned here. His writings are included in an Everything bundle, one of the first subscription bundles available on Substack. And Nathan, I know you also have a podcast called Talk Therapy that you host with Dan Schipper. And funny story here, Dan and I actually, we know each other, we go way back. We went to school, and he probably doesn't remember, but we did grab coffee in downtown Philly when we were both working on our startups. So it's really nice to see the two of you collaborate. It's really amazing. And as a creator and writer myself, I am so excited to have you here, and especially like I think right now with the growth of the passion economy and the rise of audio to all the changes that we will see given COVID, I'm sure you have a lot to say about disruption theory and also the future of media. We're all very, very curious to learn more about it. So without further ado, welcome Nathan, and let's get this discussion started.
Thanks, Molly. That's great. So just to kick it off, Nathan, one of the things that we often like to start with is to really understand kind of about you and your process as a writer. And so we're gathered here to talk about disruption theory. But before we get into the details of that, I want to hear more about like your story and your career. So I understand you've sort of held product roles at media companies, business strategy roles at platform companies, and now you kind of went from a one-man media company to a multi-person media company and kind of an aggregator in one form or another. So I would just love to hear kind of, talk us through that a little bit, kind of the decisions and what brought you to writing Divinations and kind of creating the Everything bundle.
Yeah, totally. Well, I've definitely always loved writing generally, nonfiction specifically, and like business kind of oriented nonfiction, even more specifically, like going back to at some point in college, I guess I wandered into like the business section of Barnes and Noble and just found something that looked interesting and kind of kept going from there. And I mean, that's also like, Paul Graham's essays and like, 37 Signals book Getting Real is like what got me into the internet.
Mm-hmm.
And like just the whole like lean startup stuff, like this is stuff that like was extremely popular like 10 years ago and remains extremely popular, but back in like 2010ish or whatever, when I was first kind of like getting into technology, that was like the thing that everybody was reading, and I just loved it and I wanted to like be a part of that. So of course I wrote like some things on the internet, and a lot of it didn't go too well, but I just always have kind of liked doing that. And the other kind of like formative thing for me, I guess, on the path to this was I used to work at a company called Olark that does live chat software. And it was like amazing team of people, really cool product, but I really wanted to get into something kind of like closer to media. So, and like, I guess like education-ish media, education flavored media basically, or like media flavored education, somewhere in the middle of those. And so I started working on this project to like build an interactive thing, teaching people how to code by doing like projects from their browser, and ended up selling it to General Assembly and joining General Assembly. And that was like kind of a really big fancy piece of content that had all this interactive stuff built in, but it was very like kind of inspired by like, I don't know if anyone remembers like the New York Times like snowfall post. It's basically like this like cool, rich, interactive storytelling possibilities because of computers, like was very inspiring to me. So wanted to use stuff kind of like that in some way to teach people how to code. And then from there started a company called Hardbound that took this sort of like tappable slideshowy format from this coding tutorial that I made, and just was like, okay, what if we built a whole platform like around this? And we realized that it was very tough for like it's not the kind of content people would create casually, right? Like it's not like Twitter or Snapchat or Instagram. It's more like it's media, right? It's like there's supply that's specialized and compensated, and there's demand of everyone else, like movies or books or anything else. And so we started creating a lot of those ourselves, and it was like pretty good. We had a couple thousand paying subscribers, but it was just very tough to create them. So we ended up running out of cash. It wasn't like the best like venture bet. So didn't raise more money, but it was like learned a lot of things about like
building. What era was that?
What era?
Yeah.
2015 was when I founded it and shut it down in 2017.
Cool.
Yeah.
It does remind me of there's a bunch of people who've taken different approaches to that kind of like new storytelling and neo storytelling. Feels like every few years there's kind of a new approach to that. So I'm curious if you feel like that experience soured you on that whole category and you're really into the simpler stuff now, kind of more kind of traditional formats, or do you think that there's still, massive format and platform adaptation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I'm like soured in some ways, but I would say more like I see more clearly where it can go wrong. And where it can go wrong is a very limited pool of people who have the desire or talent to make something in a non-traditional format, and really limited distribution channels and therefore promotional kind of like paths for non-traditional formatted content. But still, you can create really amazing user experiences with it. And actually, in a lot of ways, like I would love to be able to use the platform of everything to ship more stuff that's kind of like that. Because it's like we have email lists, we can link to something. You know what I mean? Like we have the distribution channel, we have the monetization, like to justify it. Like we can look, like, did paying subscribers like this? Did it cause new people to become a paying subscriber? Then like, cool, we can justify investing in it. And so I've had a lot of ideas on that front, and it feels like an economies of scale thing where like we're just not there yet, but like the bigger we get, the more we'll be able to justify the upfront investment into like cooler interactive projects or something like that. So it's like, it's basically still for sure in my mind, but it's just I see a lot of the problems a lot more clearly, and I'm like a little bit less blindly enthusiastic about it as I was, but still very enthusiastic about that kind of way of presenting content.
Right. That's cool. I think there's an interesting lesson in there for a lot of kind of product and platform kind of companies and developers today that are thinking about media tools, because you've sort of taken a journey where you've figured out that being a creator of media actually may inform the kinds of products or platforms that you might go to fill in, instead of first building the platform and then figuring out how to create on it.
I think
when
it's
you
way
get
better.
two together.
I think it's way better to go like audience first and start with the format that's like simpler, and then you can move into stuff that's more sophisticated and creates the need for like higher investment up front. But like really hard to I mean, Quibi's learning this. Really hard to like put in a lot of upfront investment in content with like unclear demand for the content.
Yep. Cool. Okay. Well, I didn't mean to get you off track. I'm just interested in digging into your background. So you were telling about,
So
Hardbound.
Did Hardbound for a couple of years, didn't end up working out. After that, I joined Gimlet Media, and it was their head of product, but like, you know, it was a podcasting company. So their product was really like their audience that they sold ads against, right? And so, but they were very interested in new kinds of like basically forward integrating into their distribution a little bit more. And so we had a lot of different ideas, and some of which we built and some of which we didn't. There's also a lot of like data stuff and like basic marketing type stuff that really required some sort of like tech help from. I didn't end up staying that long because the company was kind of like heading towards essentially like this world where they're like, okay, we need to like get to profitability. And they ended up actually just selling to Spotify. But you know, the prospect of like hiring a bunch of software engineers felt less attractive than it did when they initially hired me. So I was there for a little while and then joined Substack, and I was there for
just a second on Gimlet. Wasn't that was the one that there was a TV show made about it?
Yeah, startup.
Can you point to the person who's you?
I didn't have a prominent enough role in history to earn placement in the television series.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if that's good or bad, because like Matt Lieber, who is my boss, the character that ended up playing him was like not a fair representation of everything that was very critical to the success of Gimlet. And I don't know if the character in that TV show was as much. So I can't decide if I'm lucky or unlucky by not meriting a placement in the TV series.
Right. Well, I'm curious, when you decided to go there, you'd sort of gone from working on kind of a product and then moving toward more of a creator, a piece of media, right? Kind of a media entity, media org. So when you make that kind of decision, are you doing it within the context of any of these ideas that you're writing about today in disruption? Like, is that core to your thought process, or is it, you know, a whole different set of trade-offs that you're thinking about?
That's a good question. Honestly, I don't think I was that strategic about it at the time. My main thought was, my company just failed. I'm totally out of energy and money. Like, what can I do? And I just emailed Matt Lieber and I was like, hey, like, you know, my Hardbound, I'm shutting down Hardbound. I'm trying to figure out what's next. Like, it'd be cool to grab coffee. And he was like, oh, hey, like, there may be something we could do together. And so I talked to a few other companies. Like, I was deciding between a couple of different ones. And I decided more based on just emotions about like who I wanted to work with, and more so than like the strategy of the company or like a bear case or a bull case for like my role or the business or anything like that. And I mean, maybe that's part of the reason why my role ended up getting eliminated a year later, is like, maybe I could have predicted that, but I don't regret it in any way, because I learned so much. And I think it was really valuable to spend some time working in a media company, very different than a technology company. I've mostly worked for companies that are a little bit closer to just like pure tech, although General Assembly is obviously not pure tech, and I worked there for a while. But you know, I think there's a whole different culture around of journalism, right? That it was really valuable for me to get a little bit of a taste of.
And then you went from there to Substack, so it's kind of from media to platforms again.
Yeah, so Substack was a lot more like, I definitely had a great feeling about the people and continue to, but I was a lot more like, this thing is going to work. I just see it. And like, so when I first heard about it, I was like, oh, I should have done that. You know what I mean? So I like emailed the founders, and like, I basically used my like Gimlet, you know, because I'm like, hey, like this would be useful for podcasts too. And it's funny because like almost exactly a year later, I was probably like writing the code to build podcasting support in Substack. But yeah, like it was just like one of those things where I was like, this is a great business. These are great founders. Like, this is going to work. And so I wasn't, when I first reached out to them, I wasn't like planning on joining them. I just wanted to see if there was something like we could do with Gimlet in them. But you know, when I was leaving Gimlet, I was basically like, they were very high on my list of people to talk to, and we ended up just, yeah, it worked out.
It's awesome. And then you went from platform back to, well, I guess there were a few things in between there, but how did you decide that you wanted to leave Substack, and kind of how did you think about the choices that eventually got you to Divinations?
Yeah, totally. Well, when I joined Substack, my role was basically like that. My title was VP of product, but like what the company really needed was someone who could write code and do it really well. And so I can do that, but I can't do it like really well. So there was certainly like product work to do, but there was just, it was like a relatively quick and simple discussion about like what we should build. And it was like, all right, we just got to build it now. And so like the vast majority of my time, I wasn't like anything close to a PM or like a VP of product or whatever. Like, it doesn't make any sense. I was the first employee at a company where it was like the 3 founders and me. So like, you know, I'm writing code all day, and like, that's great. And I was totally willing to do that for like a while, but then it sort of just became more clear that like, that was how it was probably going to be for like a long time. And, you know, I've heard since then that it's like, yeah, like the first product hire at like a startup where like one of the founders is like running product is like a little bit different than like if you're used to, you know, being the CEO of a company or being a PM at like a larger company where you have more latitude or whatever. And that definitely fit my experience. And it was like an amazing place to work. I learned a ton. They're great people, but it just wasn't like my sort of like skills and stuff that I'm excited to do and all that, like just wasn't a fit for what was most valuable to the company. And so I wasn't super happy, but I wasn't like angsty about it. It was just kind of like, you know, how it feels when it's not a fit.
Yeah.
Like you wish it was a fit, but what can you do?
Yep.
Yeah, that makes sense. I want to ask about, I think there's like a lot of questions related to disruption theory and your writing that also we can weave into her personal decisions and career journey and like thinking around the everything bundle. But just first, for people who don't have as much background or want a refresher, I wanted to ask if you could give a quick summary of the theory and sort of where you're netting out on it now. I thought your 4-part series was really interesting. And like, to me, it keeps coming back to like, what is the relationship between a startup and an incumbent? And different people have different ways of thinking about that. And like, some of it is probably post facto, trying to explain a situation versus like what you think when you're in the moment as one of the players. So yeah, do you want to just give everyone a quick overview and sort of what your thinking is now after writing these 4 pieces, the 5th coming out soon?
Yeah, totally. I think you nailed it when you said it's fundamentally about the relationship between like a startup and an incumbent, right? Because there's a lot at stake understanding the dynamics there. If you're a big company, you don't want to be driven out of business. And if you're a small company, you want to succeed. And succeeding usually means succeeding despite the fact that there's somebody else who's like serving people that they'll be switching to you somehow. Even if it's a new market, like there's other people in the space that may respond. And so like, will they be able to respond effectively or not, right? Like that's sort of like the question. And so, you know, that's the question that I think before Clay Christensen, most people basically just assumed like people screwed up. It was like, oh, what do you know? Sometimes people make mistakes. It's like, and I think Clay Christensen, out of kind of his own, I would say probably a lot of it is generosity of spirit, was like, okay, these people were like hailed as geniuses on their rise. And then now that they're at the top, they're being, all of a sudden their IQ dropped by like, you know, 50 points. Like what's going on here? Like that's probably not the most realistic explanation. Reality is probably more interesting than that. So like, what is actually going on? And that was kind of like the origin of his theory of disruption, which he developed in papers throughout the 90s when he was at Harvard Business School, and then kind of culminating in his book, I think published in 97, called The Innovator's Dilemma. That's become like the classic. It's the most popular book. It's the reason why TechCrunch Disrupt is called Disrupt, and why everyone says so-and-so disrupted so-and-so, even though it's like often not, you know, a very rigorous, you know, application of the term in like the sort of original Christiansonian sense or whatever. But the basic idea is that you have companies that come into a market and they have a product and they find some initial customers because it solves a problem, and then they keep improving it because people want it to be improved. They want it to be new and improved, right? And so those improvements add up over time. And eventually, the interesting thing is they're actually able to improve the product more often than not past the point of what people need. So it's getting like, it's like the, you know, a good example is like the Gillette razor with like 7 blades or whatever. It's like, how many do you really need or whatever? And so they keep adding more stuff to it that like allows them to, you know, serve their best customers willing to pay the highest prices. And they're kind of ignoring these people who like are at the lower end of the market, or maybe aren't even participating in the market because their needs are simpler. Maybe they'd prefer for it to be cheaper. They'd prefer for it to be more accessible and convenient. Maybe they'd prefer for it to be more like customizable and modular so they can only get a piece of it rather than having to buy this whole package deal or whatever. These are the kind of reasons that Clay Christensen usually points to as like sort of essentially like potential energy for some new startup to come in and serve those people with those needs. And the interesting thing that happens is you'd think the incumbent competitors would say like, oh, wait, these people are coming up from the bottom. Let's like go serve those people. But actually what they do is they tend to flee because they're like, great, these are our lowest margin customers. Like, we don't actually care. It's like, that's not a great business. Like, you can just take that. It's not worth us to like, it's not worth it to do some sort of like big competitive response or whatever. And there's a certain degree of potentially like cognitive bias where it's like, okay, our product like is just better, and like anyone like who's serious about this stuff will graduate to our product at some point. We're at the top of the market. That means we're the best or whatever. And so, but what ends up happening is the startup, the new company that comes in, actually in a lot of cases can follow that same trajectory of improvement as the original, but now baked into it is their new value proposition that's like better in some orthogonal way. So it's like, it's not only high enough quality to do the original job that the like high-end customers needed, but also it's cheaper or more convenient or more configurable and customizable or more portable. So like a good example is like the iPhone. You know, I can write emails on it. I can read on it. I can like view maps on it. I don't need paper anymore for like a wide variety of things. It can do the job just as well. But like originally cell phones couldn't, right? And so basically like cell phones disrupted like paper maps or whatever, kind of in this classic sense, because they were worse at first, but they were better in some other way. But then they got better in the original way too, to the point where it's like you got all of the orthogonal benefit and a lot of the like original benefit that like the sort of classic people in the market wanted. And at that point, the incumbent is really screwed because now the iPhone is good enough to serve as your paper map and it's good at all these other things. So why do I need a paper map at all? And it's basically like paper maps are now obsolete. And so that's like the rough like version of disruption, the kind of like short version. I don't know if that's what you're going for.
Yeah, no, that's
Cool.
great. We have some questions coming up. You talked a little bit about in your pieces how disruption is playing out today with the passion economy. And Molly, do you want to ask your question related to that?
Yeah, sure. So I was just wanting to get your take on if you have any thoughts around Clubhouse and whether they will succeed in disrupting like the audio and podcast space. I don't know whether you've tried it out. I've been using it momentarily here and there, but hasn't really stuck, I'd say. But I think their concept is really interesting, and at least like trend-wise, it's going somewhere. So just curious to get your take.
Yeah, for sure. I have tried Clubhouse. I think Clubhouse is awesome. It is definitely, I think, has the potential to be disruptive for traditional podcasts because it's got that sort of like, it's worse in some ways, but better in others thing. And like, maybe it could become better in all ways, right? And that would be the trajectory it would need to be on to actually become disruptive. And so basically, I think it definitely has the potential to be disruptive. And so then the question is, okay, what do they need to do in order to make it actually become disruptive? And I think the answer is it needs to be actually as entertaining as podcasts, which sometimes it is now, but a lot of times it is not. You know, you hop in, the conversation's kind of meandering. You're not sure what's going on. You're not sure who's here, what they're talking about. It's kind of like, maybe I'll just switch back over to the daily. I know exactly what I'm going to get. It's for sure going to be good. But there's this orthogonal benefit of Clubhouse, which is like, you can talk, you can meet people. There's like, maybe people are talking about something live that's going on that's better. All these things are like, I think Clubhouse has hit a point where when it was originally starting, it was like a very tight group of people. And so it was kind of an incredible experience. And then now it's a little bit looser and the product mechanisms haven't caught up to the scale. And so I think the experience isn't quite as good as it used to be, but I don't think that's inevitable. I think that's just sort of like, there's a lag where like the normal course of any startup is you scale and then like something breaks and you fix it, which enables you to scale more. And so I think that's probably what's going on inside Clubhouse right now is they're like figuring out what to do now that there's like a couple thousand people rather than a couple hundred people. And you'll see them start to ship more stuff and it'll maybe like make the experience feel better, or maybe they won't be able to solve the problems, right? Like you could just stall out at a certain point, but I think that they'll probably figure out a lot of the stuff and it'll unlock kind of like better experiences and make it go forward. So maybe for them, the answer is more scheduled shows or whatever. And like they're doing some of that, they're integrating that into the work. Maybe it's like better like Q&A with the audience so you feel more included, or like some way to sort of like for people to orient themselves in a room if they join halfway through, like, wait, hold on, what are we actually talking about? Like, there's all these sort of problems that there's ways that they could solve probably. And as they solve them, those are essentially what Clay Christensen would call like sustaining innovations, where they're like rising this trajectory of improvement of like entertainingness essentially. Cause like the job to be done of Clubhouse is basically like, when I can't use my eyes, give me something to do that's like entertaining and, that's like the same job as podcasts. But then the orthogonal interesting other benefit is like also maybe I could meet people or build my own reputation or like interact with people in a way that like I'm learning about something more actively because I'm talking. There's all these sort of other jobs that can happen when it's like live and when you can talk. Or like maybe a job is like get me closer to my heroes or something like that. If there's like, I was like in a room with Tiffany Haddish and I was like, what the hell? This is amazing. It was like she asked me like why my parents learned spades, or so we're talking about spades. It's just like the most random thing, but it's like cool because like somehow I'm talking to Tiffany Haddish. Anyway, so I think basically they're in that spot where like podcasts are like up here and it's like this is the improvement curve of podcasts, and then Clubhouse is like down here and they're kind of like need to do more sustaining innovations to get them up towards podcast level of entertainingness essentially.
But presumably some of the features of Clubhouse, like the live aspect of it, or the fact that you have a whole new set of suppliers who wouldn't identify themselves as podcasters, give them the types of characteristics that an incumbent podcast creator app or publisher or hub like an Apple Podcast or Google Play wouldn't be able to respond to, if you sort of tied it back to the kind of the Christensen style, right?
Yeah, totally. Like that's actually an interesting, the orthogonal benefit is not just that you can talk, it's also that you can listen to the kinds of people that don't have podcasts. I totally forgot about that. But yeah, it's like it's in a rougher form, obviously. So it's worse in some ways. Like the audio quality is worse. It can ramble, whatever. But like it's also better in some ways because it's like there's a limited set of people that are going to go to the trouble to publish a podcast. And it's kind of like TikTok versus YouTube maybe. Like Clubhouse is a little bit more TikTok-y, where it's like people can create really compelling stuff on there and you like can lower the barrier, and you can like maybe Clubhouse will have some way to like surface the really true, most interesting things like algorithmically or something in the same way that TikTok does. But yeah, it's definitely the kind of thing where Apple and the existing podcast ecosystem basically can't do anything because they're built on this RSS technology, which just doesn't support what Clubhouse does. And so you can create a copy, but then that's just like a new thing. Like it's actually even different from normally with disruption, like TikTok disrupting YouTube is really different from Clubhouse disrupting podcasts, because YouTube is a company that controls the experience end to end, and they could create a TikTok clone like within YouTube, and they probably are. I don't know what their deal is, but like they're probably going to do something like that. But podcasts, who owns podcasts? Nobody. It's this open standard. So like, what can Apple do? Like they don't control the feeds that they're ingesting into their app, into their directory. What can you do if you're a podcast host? Like, nothing. You just can create like a new Clubhouse app, but that's not podcasting at all. You're just creating like a Clubhouse competitor basically, and Clubhouse is already doing that. So like there's not really like a competitive response that anyone can do. Spotify is in a little bit more of a position to do something like that though, because they actually do control the end to end. They have a relationship with lots of podcasters and with lots of listeners directly, whereas the other platforms, it's like if you're an app, you have a relationship with listeners but not podcasters, and if you're a hosting platform, then you have a relationship with podcasters but not listeners. So you're sort of like stymied and you can't really like respond or innovate.
Actually, so that's interesting. Yeah. So I sort of went to the Apple and Google Play kind of hub as the potential competitor, which is not a credible competitor. But I think you mentioned Spotify, and that's maybe a more credible, they may have a more credible approach to it. You know, it still seems like the service that they offer is so substantially different that it'd be hard to see it. But like, let's say you're an exec at Spotify today, like what do you do? Do you try to respond? Do you just observe it? Like, you know, kind of given everything you know about disruptive theory.
I would DM Paul on Twitter and offer 300 million easily. Like that's a trivial amount of money for Spotify to waste if it doesn't become a thing. And it's a huge threat if Clubhouse doesn't become a thing. And it's a huge threat if Clubhouse does become a thing. I think the lesson from also like the bigger they get, the more like antitrust stuff would cause problems. Like I think the lesson from Instagram is like you need to like not ignore new networks coming out. Like the lessons from Instagram and TikTok. Like basically like the cost of a false positive where it's like it's not actually going to be a big deal, but like you overpaid is like pretty low relative to the cost of like a false negative where it's like you think it's not going to be a big deal, but it actually becomes a big deal. This is like that could be a huge problem.
Yeah, so asymmetry is just like we see in technology all over the place, right?
Totally. Also, we have Vidi here who says so many thoughts here, and I know he has thoughts on this. His app.
Yeah, I want to hear his thoughts.
Sure. Come on up.
It's a good question too.
Yeah, no, I think the Clubhouse question was pretty good. I think I think from what I've observed, I think Clubhouse has done a really good job of like just letting more people create audio content, because just making a podcast is actually hard. But I think the big other issue, which is huge, is just the discovery of the content, because there's just like so much audio content, and you're just like, holy shit, what am I gonna listen to? And I think one of the ways to just deal with RSS and like surfacing good discovery is just like breaking a podcast into smaller parts, which is kind of what I'm trying to do. But yeah, that's how, like, I think my framework is just like, think of it as a marketplace, and then there's listeners, and then there's creators. You know, like Clubhouse is going after the creators, and like who's going to go after the listeners?
Claro.
Yeah,
What's up?
Oh, sorry.
So was there somebody else was chiming in? Or maybe it was an accidental unmute. So this whole topic we're talking about actually, you know, is one that Mishy and I were discussing a bit beforehand, and I'm curious to get some of your thoughts on this, Nathan, because you've spent so much time thinking about the disruption theory of Christensen, and then the 95% you agree with and 5% you disagree with, and you know we're still kind of waiting to hear the full synthesis in episode 5 of your blog. But one thing which I think Christensen doesn't have a lot of context on when he kind of established the theory is all of the things that happen in new supply side networks. Because I think he was kind of creating disruption theory within the context of like the firm that is the supplier and creates the product and sells it into the demand, which is the consumer. And yeah. I think a lot of times we see things like you mentioned Uber. And I think Uber is not really providing the product as much as they're a mediation layer on aggregating suppliers and demand. And I think Christensen stuff wasn't really built in a world where any of that kind of stuff exists. So the Airbnbs of the world, the Uber, Clubhouse with, aggregating new supply and listener and attention. How do you think Christensen would think about that? Or is that an area to explore sort of the gaps in his conclusions?
That is an interesting thing that I need to think about more. I don't have a really smart response, but I do think that he would start by thinking about it from the perspective of jobs to be done and like what company is best sort of like architected to serve that job to be done in the best way. And so if you think about something like Uber, I think he'd pretty quickly spot that like, okay, if the job to be done is like get from point A to point B, and like option A is like call a taxi company, be completely unclear on when the thing might actually arrive, have a kind of like, mediocre like experience in the actual car or whatever, and then like have to like pay in cash through some like thing, or it's like a worse experience than like having an app, knowing exactly where the person is on their way, knowing what route is going to be taken, like having it be like a newer car or whatever, like a more consistent kind of like ride experience, that like that's like a premium experience, and some people would be willing to like pay more for it. And because it's a premium experience, it's not traditionally disruptive, because normally he's thinking about, okay, if something is an innovation that makes something perform better, then the people who are already in the market have an incentive to do that. And then, so this is one of those like big holes in disruption theory, is like, well, why didn't taxi companies build Uber? Because they were the incumbents and they had an incentive to move up market, and Uber is up market from them. And so why didn't they already go there? It's a very interesting puzzle, basically. And like, if you think about it from the sort of like abstract disruption theory world, it's like, well, yeah, they had every incentive to. And if you think about it in the real world, it's like, well, they had no concept of it, they had no capabilities to do it. It wasn't built into their DNA. They didn't have that as like a competency. So of course they weren't going to be the first to see something like that, because they weren't like going around looking for new like app ideas or whatever. Like they were just trying to run their business, and they were probably focused on like managing costs or something, like, you know, like milking a business that had been around for decades in a very stable kind of like equilibrium. Um, I think that's where reality gets more complex than the model, is basically like, what's the DNA and the motivation and the like perception, and like what's the information world of the people running this business, you know? But then I think still Clay probably would have said like, you know, well, okay, fine. Like maybe they wouldn't originate it, but they would like respond really quickly. As soon as they saw this new thing, they can put two and two together, and like, you know, they have a lot of resources, more than some tiny startup. Like why wouldn't they come at it? And I think that that's like, maybe he couldn't have foreseen just how quickly venture capital can pour in to like help scale. Like, you know, in the 80s, like would VC money have as been able to as efficiently scale like Uber? Or like just scaling efficiently generally is different in a world where people have like smartphones, right? Maybe like there's just more delays when you're dealing with like physical things, you know, like computer hardware, which is like mostly what his case studies are about. Less so, it's less so about software or networked kind of products. But yeah, it's a really interesting like kind of edge case. That's honestly one of the main. It's like if you look at Tesla, if you look at the iPhone, if you look at Uber, these are companies that don't fit disruption, but feel like they sort of should. Like the theory should explain stuff like that, but it really doesn't. So like, what's the problem here? And that's like kind of the heart of the puzzle of what the series that I am writing / wrote is about.
Do you imagine that you come to the end of it and you have a new brand like the Nathan theory on how this stuff all hangs together, or?
No, I mean, that would be cool. I don't think that I have like the credentials to, you know, gain like a following in like the strategy like world like that. But, you know, maybe, who knows? I think more what I'm trying to do is like just think it through in public for myself as an indulgence. That's like, it's the kind of thing that I wanted to do for a long time as just a person who like, you know, reads Clay Christensen or Hamilton Helmer or whatever, like for fun and because I'm an entrepreneur and all that stuff. But then like, you know, to have the time to actually like really go deep on the research and like really think it all through and write something about it is kind of like an unimaginable luxury and fun perk of the job. So yeah, and like, you know, if as a side effect other people find it useful and there's like a name for it or whatever, then like that's awesome. But I'm not as I'm not like trying to make fetch happen, you know? Like I think
right.
One of the biggest mistakes that a lot of content creators make is they get really cute with like naming things and like they try too intentionally to coin terms. And I think that's like basically putting the cart before the horse. Like you should try to have original insight and to express it clearly. And if it works and if there's demand for that, then like the side effect of it is you've coined a term. But like when you try and come up with a term, usually it's like you're trying to make fetch happen and there's not actually, it doesn't work.
I actually know what you mean when you say that.
Yeah.
I'm wondering how many people know what that is.
Yeah. The audience who, you haven't seen the classic American film Mean Girls, it's absolutely on like any legitimate top 100 films of all time.
Amazing. Nadia asked a question that literally was in my head. So do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, for sure. I think like what you were just talking about sort of had me thinking about like how important is like brand versus product for disruption, and whether there's space sort of in this model of disruption for a disruptive brand without necessarily like a differentiated or disruptive product. or like does that sort of technically like then not fall as a disruptor? And I think like an example that came to mind from the discussion is like a hims and hers, and like would that qualify as sort of disruptive or not? And if so, like how much of it is sort of their product and business model versus the brand? And also, I love Mean Girls, so total classic nostalgia geeking out.
Yeah. I actually, it's funny because I haven't thought about this a lot before. I think the answer that Clay Christensen or Hamilton Helmer, who wrote Seven Powers, and it's like very closely related to a lot of these ideas. I think what most people would say is like, there's no such thing as like a disruptive brand, because disruption is actually about like functional attributes of a product that are serving a specific part of the market. And like the brand is just kind of like the reflection of that. So you can have a disruptive like value proposition and business model, but so the brand feels sort of disruptive-ish, but like if you don't have those things, then the brand itself isn't actually disruptive. But I think there's this thing that the place where my head goes is like editorial brands. So like, I think that there are some, I think you can actually sort of have like an actually disruptive brand where it is truly the brand that's doing the work, where it's literally like the same kind of thing, but just positioned at a different audience that's underserved. And actually the same type of thing that happens with disruption can happen here functionally, which is that the incumbent brand can't change because they would cannibalize their existing business. And so they just have to flee and let you take what you're sort of like more specifically targeting. So like, you know, if I'm like Viagra or whatever, like I can't copy Hims. Like I've got too much brand equity with like the people who I'm targeting to like what can I even do? Like, what would that even mean? They just change their font or something? Like they change their whole tone, and it's like the Steve Buscemi, like "Hello, my fellow kids" thing. Like it just wouldn't work, you know? And so I think actually there may be something to this idea of like actually having disruptive branding, but I haven't thought it through. So there's a big asterisk on it, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah,
it seems like.
Oh, sorry. I was particularly thinking of that when you brought up in your pieces luxury businesses and sort of status businesses, and thinking about the potential for disruption in those spaces. Like in a way, they seem almost more vulnerable to sort of brand, like a disruptive brand or new storytelling or marketing force coming up. And like, especially today, when if you have like an influencer or a celebrity with a big following, you could see them making a space for themselves in an area like Kylie Jenner with cosmetics, or I don't know, there's probably several examples, but yeah, I wonder how you would think about that in terms of these businesses that you wrote traditionally have been harder to disrupt, like very status oriented.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think we look at stuff like Soho House today, and it's probably gonna feel kind of like the Elks Lodge or Shriners or whatever in like 70 years. Like that used to be so cool, like being like a Freemason or whatever. Like that was like the same thing basically. And so I do think that there is sort of like generational churn, and like some things can kind of like escape gravity. Like, you know, I don't know why that happens for some things and not others. Like maybe you just have to be really deliberate about renewing your brand and like sacrificing your older audience for the sake of attracting newer audience for the sake of growth. And like it's like a painful activity that those kinds of brands have to consciously choose to do. Otherwise they fade into irrelevance. But it's a really delicate creative choice because you have to connect your sort of like, whatever the word they always use is like heritage to like the new thing. You can't like give up your soul or whatever. Yeah, I think it's interesting to ponder. I'm really hesitant to like map it too closely onto disruption because I know it's talking about totally different stuff typically, but it is really interesting to think through what are the similarities in the way that sort of like new entrants can essentially steal customers from the incumbents in spaces that are governed more by brand than functional benefits or whatever.
Do you think about that with your own work, like building the everything bundle and sort of your own business strategy brand? How does that play into?
Yeah, that's great. Let's get into that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're focusing on a different kind of writing that's like from the perspective of practitioners and written for practitioners, and focused more on like analysis and commentary rather than like breaking news and scoops and the inverted pyramid and all that stuff. Cause like that's important. I'm really glad that there's a lot of people doing that and that they're good at their job. But it's not all that I want. And I think in other realms, there's a lot of writing that's like this, that there's a very good supply of. Like if you want to read about like sort of general cultural commentary, like you can go to the New Yorker for this kind of writing. You can go to, if you're like particularly fancy, you can go to like N+1 or like whatever. There's all these sort of like options for really high quality, like non-news commentary analysis-ish type writing. But like within business, like for practitioners / by practitioners, like there's not nearly as much. And mostly it's because practitioners aren't good writers. Like some are, but like most, it's like there's not a great supply of that. So like we're trying to sort of like create a new supply or discover a new supply. But yeah, that's it's a very different editorial like agenda that we have. And it's not that we're the only ones doing it. Like, of course, like we have like peers that are really, really great, but we're just trying to build like a company around it in a way that it doesn't seem like there is a company that does this yet.
So it seems like it has a bunch of kind of new structural properties to it. Like if you compare it to a media organization that grew up, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So you don't have, obviously like a big office in Manhattan, and you don't have a bunch of trucks that drive around the streets, a printing press. And so, distribution and creation and monetization is sort of all simplified and on the internet and remote and virtual. So is that sort of like a foundational set of things that you sort of observed in the world? And then do you imagine that someday this could be, kind of something of I don't know, a publishing empire, a media brand, or is it the new New York Times, the new Wall Street Journal or something? Or how do you think about sort of what this looks like 10 years from now?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the sort of like the real galaxy brain take on it is like probably the people in the best position to solve problems are those who deeply understand an audience and can write something that like is rewarded with attention and dollars. And so yes, writing and analysis and commentary is really important, but like also we could build software, like we could bundle in like all sorts of things potentially, and maybe it becomes some sort of crazy like Amazon Prime for business or whatever. But like, I don't know. I mean, that's like, it's we're trying to write really good stuff that people love to read, and like we do have some software that we've built, like particularly for super organizers, which is productivity focused. Like we have some productivity software that we've built, and it's a little bit like toy software, but like a lot of software starts out that way. And it is genuinely kind of useful. But really our main focus is on the writing and analysis, and to make sure that it's the kind of thing that, our subscribers feel like they're getting a lot of value out of it every week, that there's like multiple articles that were really, really important to them, and that created a lot of like just kind of like joy. Like the other thing that I think we're doing that feels kind of different to me from most business writing is like we would like to reach for beauty, and I don't know if we actually can attain it, but like it just feels like there's a sort of low ambition with a lot of business writing. That's kind of like, can I say something smart that's like using jargon or whatever? And like, I don't know, like ideally we can write stuff that might matter in years, like there are classic articles of like, whatever, like Harvard Business Review, like what is strategy? That's like a classic thing. Or like marketing myopia was written decades ago and people can still reference it. And like, so it does exist. There are like patterns for it, but it's like, I don't know where it's being deliberately, maybe not like accomplished, but like reached for even on a regular basis now.
Do you have like a target or a goal or an imagination for what the ideal bundle consumer experience is? Is it that I get a certain number of articles per day from voices that are familiar, or am I getting like a diversity of voices or new voices a couple times a week, or depends on sort of what shows up? Or how do you think about what that kind of experience is?
Yeah, I mean, ideally, it's a really nice balance between consistency and novelty, where the people you love, you get regularly and you have this like solid sort of trusted relationship, but then also you can explore, and there's sort of like enticing paths that present themselves to you for exploration. that allow you to go deeper into stuff you didn't even know you were interested in, but that you find really rewarding as you get there, or that you can reach for in weird, interesting scenarios. Like you just meet someone who's working on this thing and you're like, wow, that's so fascinating. I never heard about that. And then you could like come home and look up some stuff. And we have some really great articles about that world that you're like, I never knew. Like, you know, you meet someone who's got like some sort of weird new Costco competitor, and you can read Adam Kiesling's article on how Costco does their white label, you know, Kirkland brand stuff. It's like fascinating. Like that could become useful if you're making an investing decision, or, you know, just advising a friend, or just interested for whatever reason. Like that's really the goal. And like, I think that's when bundles work well. That's like the real magic, is like, it's the kind of thing that is worth paying for, but you don't know any given month or week, like what exactly you're going to need. There's a few pillars that you're like primarily there because of, but like, there's also all this other stuff that you get. And so you get this real sense of like abundance. It's like this magic feeling when you first sign up for Spotify. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't have to pay like $10 for an album. Like I can listen to like opera. Like I would never buy an opera CD at Best Buy, but like, why not? Like, what's going on with Pavarotti? Like I've never heard it before, you know? And so like, that's a fun thing that hopefully we can have some similar thing for learning about various little spheres in the economy.
Yeah, we have tons of really good questions in the chat. Laura, do you want to ask yours?
Sure. So the question I have is, do you think, well, the last question I had anyway was, do you think that when somebody starts out in this area that they need to be thinking like, okay, I'm going to change the world. I need some venture capital to help me do this, so I should design everything around that. Or is this more like start with a really niche thing and then just sort of happen upon whether it could be big? And what are the sort of good and bad of each of those approaches?
Yeah, totally. I think it's all about balance. And the vast majority of people have too much of the grand vision and not enough of the like, let's just start with something that works and like see what happens from there. And so if you're more inclined to just like get started and are a little bit unsure about where it could head, but it just feels like the right thing to do now and that people would like it, then like that's amazing. And that's like a way better spot to be in than in the like grand vision, but no practical, like what's the first step kind of thinking. I do think though that it is helpful to kind of like imagine paths that could unfold and to think about which of those paths would you like to head down, so that you can like pull them closer to the present a little bit more easily, you know? And so it's not to say that there's no value to the grand vision thinking, like, but it only really matters to the extent that it affects something you're doing like soonish, you know? Otherwise it's just like talk or whatever. And then I guess the other like maybe small element to add is like, you know, I think it's generally better to not need venture capital and to just get started. If you can finance it yourself, that's awesome. If you can make money immediately such that it's cash flow positive, that's like great. But, you know, to the extent that you need venture capital in order to get started, then like, yeah, you got to have a story that sounds exciting to a VC. But that's kind of like a necessary evil more than it is like an actual good thing. I think personally, it's just kind of like, yeah, if I'm a VC, I've got to have some sort of like way that I can tell my LPs like why I invested in this company. So
like a little bit of a trap to me, because working on something that is venture backed but very early stage, I see that there are demands on what we would do that are different than, you know, if we were really just trying to understand like how to do the best thing.
Yeah, totally. I think it's potentially a very corrupting force. Honestly, there's a lot of businesses that could be really good businesses and actually would be successful, but just like they don't seem like an obvious bet for like a venture success, that model. And so it's like, do you go with the thing that probably works but may not be as big, or do you go with the thing that probably won't work, but if it does, there's like some reason to think it might be big? It's like such a hard decision to make. And I'm usually of the one that's I'm usually on the side of like, go with what you think will work. And like, sure, maybe run some little experiments on the other stuff, but like, don't like bet the farm on it or whatever. Bet the farm. That's what it was. Bet the town. Anyway, yeah, that's like usually my bias. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks. I want to transition to Max. He had a question in the chat that I saw around kind of how unbundling works between creators and platforms.
Yeah. Do you think there'll be a time, I mean, it's starting to happen now with like the TikTok fund, but do you think there'll be a time when creators kind of unbundle from their own platforms, like from their platforms, and kind of make their own things for better economics, with TikTokers moving to YouTube or Substackers maybe moving to creating their own, newsletter distribution?
Yeah, I think it's hard to answer that in the general case, but I definitely think there'll be lots of cases where that happens. But the extent to which it happens on any given platform depends on the dynamics of that platform. So like, I think that like you'll have a lot less people going from like, let's say like YouTube to Patreon, right? Like if YouTube had built Patreon natively or like had a more generous ad revenue split, there'd be a lot less potential energy for Patreon to become a thing. But I do think generally it tends towards like people search for the better deal, and competitive arbitrage means that platforms will come into existence that offer a better deal. And so that's like a lot of the energy around Substack is kind of getting siphoned off of Medium, where it's like, oh, I'm doing the same thing, except I have an email list. And I'm giving up some like distribution in Medium's feed, but like I don't really know how much that's worth. I'd rather just have the email addresses of the actual like loyal readers. And so it's interesting because like basically now Medium is like gonna let you take your email list with you in some sort of way apparently. And so like maybe there won't be so much like unbundling from platforms as it is just like platforms competing with each other forces them to offer more generous terms to creators with like less switching costs, better monetization, all that kind of stuff, because the competitive kind of force causes them to, offer a better deal essentially.
Definitely. I think that's, contrary to what Mike said, with Epic Games, obviously there's, only two places for, Fortnite to be distributed, Google Play, or the App Store. So it's kind of different, I'd say compared to, TikTok or Substack.
Yeah, totally. I think that also it would be really different in the case of like Substack and Medium if it was well known that Medium was like the only game in town where like your writing had to be on Medium if you wanted anyone to read it, like the way it is with YouTube. Like with YouTube, it's like, what can you really do if you don't have a video on YouTube? It's like it almost doesn't, you know what I mean? Like there's like specific cases for other platforms like Vimeo or Wistia, but if you want it just discovered by the general public or whatever, like you definitely want to put it on YouTube. So if Medium had attained more of that status, it would be a lot harder for Substack to compete. So I definitely think there is competitive cases where there's like more of a lock. Like with mobile generally, it's like, yeah, like iPhone and Android, it's just like they've just got a total lock on it, and there's not a lot of like competitive arbitrage happening. It's just like they own it, and it's like the cable companies or whatever. It's just like monopoly basically, or duopoly or whatever.
Awesome. I want to make a quick note on time because I know we are kind of just skipped over past the hour. We're having so much fun and we have tons of questions in the chat. So it's, want to try to get to at least another couple if you have a moment, Nathan, to
totally.
hang with us still.
I can hang for longer. It's like Clubhouse where you're like, you look up and you're like, oh my gosh, 3 hours later.
I can't believe it's 7. I was like, oh my God, what happened? I have so many questions left. Also in the chat. But Ashay had a good question if you want to ask yours.
Yeah, sure. So this is more about predictions, I guess, which aren't always great, but always fun to talk about. So from these 3 companies and their core products, which one do you think will get disrupted first? Google search, Apple iPhones or smartphones, or Amazon and online shopping?
Oh, that's really hard. I don't think any of them will be disrupted anytime soon, so I have no good answers here. But of those 3, I think maybe Amazon is the most likely one, because I think that it just feels to me personally like there's other things that could arise that would be like my first destination for buying certain categories of things online, and that could kind of like erode Amazon's position. Like probably I'm reasonably locked in with Kindle, but like, when I'm buying like dog stuff, like for my new puppy, like, I don't know. I mean, I bought some stuff off Amazon, but like I also would buy other places, and it feels like Shopify is like in a relatively strong position, and maybe there's some other like like I'm really excited. I have no clue what's going to come of it, but April Underwood's new company, like local something, I can't remember, but basically like it just feels like there's energy there that like people could buy in non-Amazon ways. But I still think Amazon would be in a very strong position with their e-commerce for a while. I just think if I'm comparing it to Google search or Apple's iPhone, I think that's probably the weakest of the three.
I've heard one of the disruptive forces that people have hypothesized around Amazon for a while is kind of that last mile delivery. And so if you wanted to paint a picture of where Amazon is at risk, I think you have to look, or one of the good places to look might be looking at how things get to people, because if you can get things to people, and if you're, let's imagine, someday in the far future, you've got somebody showing up 3 times a day, bringing you hot food that you're going to eat right out of a, container. That's not the world we live in today, but imagine that future. Whoever it is that's bringing that food could also bring your razors or your washing machine or whatever. So I think there is it's not obvious who that would be. For a while there was talk of Uber owning that, but they certainly have not run away with it.
Was that little robot company that has the little robots that are in Berkeley?
Oh yeah, these are the sidewalk ones. Yep, there's probably drones and regulation and all kinds of other factors, but I think that's, if you wanted to point to where there's a lot of probably contention and disruptive potential, it may be kind of in that last mile.
I also think on the totally other end is like Discovery, like Wirecutter. If they linked me to some other place, I would just buy it from there.
Yep. And I think I saw in the chat, was it Nadia was talking about Instagram and Facebook, which I think are kind of disruptive in that top of the funnel area where they're sort of generating demand, and then it can be fulfilled through Amazon or through wherever. It sort of commoditizes the search experience of Amazon. Well, for discovery use cases.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions?
What else do we have here?
Nate had a question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, my kids are in the background. If you hear it, they're big fans of yours too. From the garage. Your comments around going for beauty are super interesting for us. We're doing a tech startup, and we've kind of gone back and forth between going for like an Apple beautiful interface, exciting experience versus getting something on there that people like become almost religious about, but it's not really the most beautiful. With what you've highlighted in writing, especially trying to get that reaction from your readers, do you have direction on where a company should head from the beginning? Because we're just a couple months in, and I love your work, so it's been fun to kind of watch how that approaches.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I don't know if I have good advice for all situations, but I think that it's important to put like a level of. I think it's important to put a level of care into the product that a lot of people sort of like will shrug off, like, it's just the MVP or whatever. Like, let's just test it and get it out there or whatever. Like, my bias is always to like not take forever on it, but just really try and go like a little, like just do a little push to like, and like, oh, like maybe let's sacrifice some of the scope so we can spend a little bit more time polishing or whatever, like is usually, but it's one of those like at the margins things. So I'd have to like see your prototype and your plan and like what you think is good or not good in order to know like, oh, you're solid. Like you could probably launch faster, or like, you really may want to, you know what I mean? It's so hard to like calibrate that in the abstract. Cause it's just it's a balance. It's a delicate balance of like, also, I think one thing that people do too often is they wait too long to get feedback from like anyone. Like, I think that's really useful to get like a first beta with like a dozen friends and then like a dozen random people, and then another beta where you send it out to like 50 people or something, and like you're kind of like going for that polish by the time you really want to go wide, but like, you know, getting a lot of information along the way is really, really helpful. And I think generally it's a good idea to try and be more incremental. Anytime you're like, is there a way we can be more incremental about this? It's usually a good question to like ask yourself, which is not, I think, a thing that trades off with quality. It's just a way of like, what path do we take? Do we build this whole thing at once, or do we build a little bit and show it to some people and polish it and then a little more or whatever, if that makes sense.
Sure. No, super helpful. I like the incremental piece a lot. I'll focus there. Thank you.
Yeah, it's nice because it's not even necessarily about like, let's just test this. It's more like, yeah, we know we want to do it. Let's just do it incrementally so that we get feedback along the way, on the journey to making it this super polished thing that we're very whatever, So the
Totally.
testing kind of creates this expectation of like, people are like, well, what happens if it fails? Like, do we go home? Do we, test is like sort of the wrong word, I think, in a lot of cases. And like, yeah, for whatever reason that unlocked it in with me with people who are more like, hey, we should just test. And I would get very anxious, like, but it's not good yet. So what are we testing here? Like, let's ship incrementally. I'm like, oh, okay, cool. That's better.
Nadia shared a
That
nice
never happens
quote.
with us. Thank you.
Nadia shared a nice quote. It says, one of my favorite product people has a metaphor that a good MVP is like a cupcake, not a slice of cake.
I like that.
Thanks, Nadia. That's great.
Well, Leon has a really good question. You want to ask?
Nathan.
Yo, how's it going?
Good. So on newsletters, what are likely exit ops, particularly for mid-sized publications? Because we have so let's consider Strategy as like the gold standard, like largest. He's making like whatever thing, couple million a year. Last I checked. What about all the publications in between? Especially as like Josh was chatting in that other chat that we had. Like, what's going to be the plan for them? Are you going to get quiet, or you can't IPO, so.
I don't know who's acquiring, like, let's say you've got $100,000 a year newsletter, or like $200,000 a year newsletter. Charles.
Yeah, that's why I heard the corp dev role at everything is opening up soon.
All right. Yeah, no, I don't know anyone currently who's acquiring those, but we'd love to chat. I think that probably as of today, the exit option is to like get a job somewhere where you'll get a better salary and signing bonus and like better working conditions with more creative control and all that stuff. It's kind of like if you are an indie like designer developer and you make a cool app that's like sort of making a living, but like you don't want to do it anymore, you can probably get a pretty good job at a tech company somewhere because you've like proven your taste and ability in the market or whatever. And like, so they may not want to acquire your app necessarily, but you'd get like a much better job than you would had you not made that app. And also you could maybe actually, this is a really tough thing. With an app, you could put it into maintenance mode and like let it roll. But like newsletter, you get off the content treadmill and it just stops. And, so that's tougher. But I wonder if there will be a more, like maybe us or maybe other media companies will get more acquisitive about these things. I think that could be a good opportunity. The problem is, as we were talking about in the other chat, you can't pay very much of a multiple because the higher the multiple, the more risk that if the writer leaves, you've just lost a ton of money. So you can maybe pay a high multiple with like a very strict golden handcuff system, like way more strict than in tech acquisitions. But this is all very theoretical. I'm not aware of anyone's newsletter getting acquired. I mean, there is actually like back in the day with blogging, like, Ezra Klein I don't know if he got actually acquired or just got a job, but like his blog got him to the Washington Post, which got him to Vox. So maybe there's like a similar path for people now.
And wasn't that kind of the business, if I recall, Jason Calacanis was in a business that was aggregating various blogs and kind of acquiring them and building kind of a media network around it where they'd kind of cross-promote and reference each other. So, that was as old as new again, but kind of takes a little bit of a different form.
Yeah, 538 is also a great example of this happening. Yeah.
I wonder if we think, just brainstorming here, but what would the opposite look like? Like, do you think you could take your audience and monetization mechanisms and identify early talent and kind of plug them into the engine and figure out like this person's really good, but they haven't built their audience yet, but we can put them on stage?
I'm 100% confident because we've done it.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Oh, tell me about it.
Adam Kiesling?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
He's amazing. He had like written some really great posts and like wrote a Twitter thread, but he wasn't writing full time. And we were just like, Adam, you're so great. Like, can we work together? And so now we do. And he's like a core kind of like member of our team. His newsletter is doing super well. It's like better than mine now. And like, I like don't even jokingly say that because like I've been distracted basically. But like, Yeah, he's awesome, and I'm certain that we'll be able to do that more. And yeah, I think that that's basically our plan, is like help enable stuff that wouldn't otherwise exist. It's not our only source of supply or whatever, but like help enable stuff that wouldn't otherwise exist, because it's hard to do your own paid subscription business, right? Like there's a lot of commitment that goes into that, and there's a lot of ways to mess it up, basically. And it's much easier if you can kind of like plug into a machine that's already humming, you know? And so that's our goal for sure, is to help people who, you know, are unsure if they want to do it on their own, to like, let's make it happen together. And we'll take a lot of the uncertainty and risk out of it. And in multiple ways, like because we have like the operational experience to make it work, but also like just, we can finance it for you. You know, like we can give a monthly minimum or whatever, like, you know what I mean? There's like different stuff that work with different people, but yeah, we can do it. We have done it, and we want to do more of it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It kind of makes me think of something like, you know, kind of like what Y Combinator does for startups, is kind of like let a bunch of people experiment kind of cheaply, and then sort of can help provide a little bit of platform and community and some audience. And there's a lot of like mechanics like that I don't think we have, like how to bootstrap a writing business from scratch. So it's interesting that you've already sort of proven that at some, you know, at least some use cases.
Totally. It's a lot really exciting publisher, you know, because you like identify someone who's got a really interesting book idea, you help develop the book, and then you have your like infrastructure to get it in front of a lot of readers. You know, with the book publishers, they had relationships with Barnes and Noble. We have like, you know, this sort of audience that we understand the preferences, we have data, whatever, we can like recommend stuff in the right ways or structure the discovery experiments in the right ways. But yeah, that's
super cool. I guess I don't know if you've ever met Von Tan, but we met him through James Chan the other day, and he thinks a ton about this kind of stuff around like the future of publishing and books. And he's actually going to join us for Highlighter Live soon. So it might be one that you want to join and jam on, because it's going to be a good topic.
That sounds awesome.
Cool. Well, we are definitely well over time, but I want to thank you for spending the extra time with us. You know, we're coming to the end, and we do have one final question that we always wrap with. And I forget if we already gave you the preview of this, or if we're going to spring it on you.
I did, I completely forgot, but I can come up with something.
Okay. Well, we spent this past hour and change asking you questions, and what we like to do is turn the tables and give you an opportunity to ask us a question, or not us specifically, but just like to hear about the questions that you have for the world at large. They could be about stuff you're thinking about at work, or with divinations, or everything, or writing on the internet, or it could be something totally philosophical, or about your new dog, or, you know, what are your questions?
Is this like a rhetorical question, or is it like anyone can jump in and answer?
This is for you.
Here? Wait, this is for, like, I'm asking a question that I would answer?
No, you're just asking us a question. You're telling us.
That's what I'm saying. Like, am I asking everyone here a rhetorical question just to ponder, or like, are people going to actually and who all can answer? I would like everyone to answer.
Well, we can post your question on your book hub. So we have a hub on Highlighter where Divinations effectively Divinations functions as a book hub. And so we've been adding some highlights and posts there. So we can ask your question there, and then people can chime in after the fact and answer. We are wrapping this part of the session, so we'll wrap the Highlighter Live session and put a bow on the video. But yeah, we can ask your question, and sort of people who are attending or other people on the internet can chime in and answer.
Yeah, I love it. My question is, what is most confusing to you about strategy? I just always love to know like what people are pondering, you know. Because maybe they can outsource some of it to me, and I can just like come to them and be like, well, here's what I came up with. I don't know if this is helpful, but yeah.
I like that. Fabulous. That's a great one to leave us with. So we will make that we'll make that happen on the book hub, and we'll chime in and start talking about it. So first, you know, as I mentioned, thank you so much, Nathan, for joining us. You can all stay tuned for future town halls at our Discover page, which we're going to drop in the chat right now. It's just highlighter.com/discover. We've got a bunch of great ones coming up. Jason Crawford is talking about relationship between basic and applied research. Annie Duke, famous author of a traditional book publish. She's got a new book coming out called How to Decide, and we've got her joining us for launch date. And then Scott Belsky is going to join us to talk about his book, The Messy Middle. So you can stay tuned on our blog and YouTube. And if you have any favorite authors or writers who you think would be great guests on Highlighter Live, just DM us names. We're at Highlight Ideas on Twitter. And so we've got your question down, and we're going to publish the video. And so everybody wave goodbye, and thanks, Nathan. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.